The north end of Boston in the late 1940s, a place where the streets hummed with life and everyone knew each other's business. And in the middle of it all, Anthony Fats Pino, a man who wasn't just living life, he was plotting to rewrite it entirely. Fats wasn't your average guy. He wasn't interested in working a 9-to-5 or saving up for retirement. Nope, this guy wanted to make history, and he had a plan so audacious it would make Bonnie and Clyde look like amateurs. But Fats wasn't working alone. Oh no, he had a crew. First, there was Joseph Big Joe McGinnis, a man whose nickname sounded like he should be selling deli sandwiches, but who instead specialized in logistics. Then you had a ragtag mix of petty thieves, career criminals, and a few wild cards who probably thought, hey, what's the worst that could happen? Together, this gang would go down in history for pulling off the most infamous heist Boston had ever seen, the Great Brink's Robbery. It all started in 1947 when Fats set his sights on the Brink's armored car depot, a fortress of cash and securities. Now, Brink's wasn't exactly the kind of place you just stroll into. It was supposed to be impenetrable, a vault of cash guarded by the best security money could buy. But Fats wasn't fazed. He and his crew spent 2 painstaking years planning their heist. They scoped out the depot, studied guard routines, and even stole the building's locks, had duplicate keys made, and returned them without anyone noticing. These guys weren't just criminals. They were artists, painting a masterpiece of deception. By January 17, 1950, everything was in place. The gang was ready, armed with .38 caliber revolvers and dressed in chauffeur caps, pea coats, and rubber Halloween masks. They looked like they were heading to the weirdest masquerade party ever. At 7:10 p.m., they stormed the depot with military precision. The guards didn't stand a chance. The gang tied up 5 employees, forcing them to lie face down on the floor. The guards probably thought, this is definitely not in the employee handbook. The robbers then got to work, filling canvas bags with cash, checks, and securities. They moved with such speed and precision, it was almost like they were clocking in for a shift themselves. But even these meticulous masterminds had their limits. They left behind about $1 million in coins because lugging around 26,000 pounds of spare change wasn't exactly practical. By 7:37 p.m., it was over. The gang disappeared into the night, leaving behind a scene so clean it was like they'd never been there at all. When the alarm was finally raised, the Boston police were baffled. Nearly $2.8 million, roughly $30 million in today's money, was gone. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, no clues. It was as if the Brink's depot had just spontaneously decided to hand over its fortune. Back at their hideout, the gang was celebrating. But the hard part wasn't pulling off the heist, it was staying cool afterward. And as it turns out, not everyone in this crew was built for the long game. The Boston police were scrambling. $2.8 million had vanished from what was supposed to be an impenetrable fortress, and they didn't even have a fingerprint to show for it. The public was fascinated. Newspapers were running wild with headlines like "Crime of the Century," and people couldn't stop speculating about who the culprits might be. Meanwhile, Anthony Fats Pino and his crew were lying low, trying not to attract attention. But here's the thing about lying low. Not everyone is good at it. The gang had agreed to sit on the money for at least 6 years. Why 6? Because after that, the statute of limitations on armed robbery would expire, and they could start spending their loot guilt-free. It sounded simple enough. Just keep quiet, avoid suspicion, and wait. But patience isn't exactly a criminal's best quality. Joseph Specs O'Keefe, one of the crew, was the first to crack. O'Keefe had already been having second thoughts about the whole operation. He thought the loot should have been split up immediately instead of being stashed away. But Fats, ever the control freak, insisted that everyone stick to the plan. O'Keefe's frustration grew, and when the police picked him up for an unrelated robbery, he began to feel the walls closing in. At the same time, the FBI was closing in on the gang without even realizing it. They were conducting a massive investigation, following every lead, no matter how thin. Hundreds of suspects were questioned, and tips were pouring in from all over the country. Still, there was no solid evidence tying anyone to the crime. It was like the robbers had vanished into thin air, or at least that's what it seemed like. Then came the fallout. Tensions among the gang members were boiling over. O'Keefe and Stanley Gusciora, another crew member, got into a heated argument over the money, and things escalated quickly. Threats were made, alliances were broken, and it became clear that the gang's biggest enemy wasn't the FBI. It was themselves. O'Keefe, feeling betrayed and abandoned, started dropping hints to the authorities. At first, it was subtle, little breadcrumbs that didn't lead anywhere. But as his legal troubles mounted, O'Keefe realized he had a golden ticket, the truth, and he wasn't about to let it go to waste. Meanwhile, the FBI was piecing together its own puzzle. They had started to notice a pattern of unusually extravagant spending among certain individuals in Boston's criminal underworld. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the investigation alive. Slowly, they began narrowing their focus on Fat's crew. O'Keefe's cooperation was the tipping point. He provided key details about the robbery, including names, roles, and how the loot was divided, or more accurately, how it wasn't divided. With O'Keefe spilling the beans, the FBI finally had the breakthrough they needed. Arrests followed, and one by one, the members of Fat's crew found themselves in custody. But there was still one lingering question. Where was the money? With most of the gang in custody, the FBI turned its attention to the biggest question still hanging in the air. Where was the money? Nearly $2.8 million had been stolen in the Brink's robbery, and while the feds had rounded up the culprits, the loot itself was nowhere to be found. You'd think a haul that big would be hard to hide. But the gang had been just as meticulous about stashing the cash as they had been about stealing it. Anthony "Fats" Pino and his crew had agreed to hide the money in various locations around Boston. Safety deposit boxes, basements, and even random holes in the ground were used to conceal their treasure. The idea was simple: scatter the loot, wait for the heat to die down, and come back for it when the coast was clear. But, like everything else in this story, the plan didn't go quite as expected. When O'Keefe flipped on the gang, he wasn't just spilling secrets. He was also throwing the hiding spots into chaos. Some of the cash had already been moved by paranoid members who feared someone would double-cross them. In one case, a portion of the loot was destroyed when rats decided to turn the cash into nesting material. Yes, you heard that right. Literal rats got to the money before the FBI could. With the crew falling apart and O'Keefe feeding the feds every detail they needed, the case against the gang was airtight. In October 1956, nearly 7 years after the robbery, 8 members of the crew were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms. Fats, the mastermind, received a life sentence, as did Joseph "Big Joe" McGinnis and several others. O'Keefe, thanks to his cooperation, got a reduced sentence, though his reputation among his former friends was forever ruined. But what about the money? Despite their best efforts, the FBI recovered less than $60,000 of the stolen $2.8 million. The rest remains unaccounted for to this day, making it one of the largest missing treasures in American history. Some believe the cash is still hidden somewhere in Boston, while others think it was spent or destroyed over the years. Either way, it adds a tantalizing layer of mystery to an already legendary crime. The Brink's robbery wasn't just a heist. It was a turning point in how law enforcement approached organized crime. It exposed flaws in security systems, highlighted the challenges of cracking tight-knit criminal networks, and perhaps most importantly, gave Hollywood endless material for heist movies. So, what's the moral of the story? Maybe crime doesn't pay, but it sure does make for one heck of a tale. Thanks for tuning into Talescape. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that prove truth is often stranger than fiction.